Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Kirby Institute seminar series. I'm Curtis Chan, I'm a research associate here. And I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands by which we're gathering today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Today, we're meeting on the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us here today in the audience and online. So some housekeeping to start. The format of the seminar, I'll start off with a presentation followed by a Q&A session. If you are joining us online, you can ask questions by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And for our audience in the room today, a microphone is available to the side of the room to address your questions at the start of the Q&A session and at the end of the presentation. So today's presentation will be by James Bedford. James is a writer and educator at UNSW. He has published works of both fiction and nonfiction and is currently exploring the implications of generative AI in education. He completed his PhD in creative writing at UNSW in 2019 and lives on the Central Coast of New South Wales. So this is a little bit of a different seminar than what we normally do, which is usually very research focused. But this kind of came out from a need from people asking us about what are we going to do with the future of AI and writing. So James had given a seminar to some of the medicine health students last year. So we kind of asked him to revamp his workshop for a more academic audience. So can you please join me in welcoming James?
All right. Thanks, everyone. Yes, so as Curtis mentioned, my background's actually in creative writing, English literature. So I'm not a computer scientist by any means. So apologies for like the bad analogies and metaphors today. But I guess today is like a culmination of what has been a whirlwind over the last 2 years since the public release of ChatGPT, November 2022. I think it was around Christmas time that it sort of came out, and I found myself spending my hard-earned annual leave researching how to use ChatGPT and just playing around with it and seeing what it could do. And so since then, many more tools have come out. It's been, I guess, a bit of a whirlwind, as I've said. But just to kind of get a feel for the room, so hands up if you're willing to admit that you use ChatGPT in the room. Hands up if you're using it at the moment. Cool, that's most of you. Some like refusing. That's good. Other tools? Any other tools apart from ChatGPT? A couple of you. Yep. Any research tools like for AI research tools? Sort of not sure. We'll talk about those today. Anyone have a subscription? Hands up if you have a subscription to ChatGPT, like the paid subscription. A couple of you. Okay. Interesting. I might actually ask one more question. Who is familiar with the term hallucinations? All of you. Anyone not familiar with that term in relation to AI? Okay, that's okay. I asked that question primarily, I've been asking at the beginning of every workshop I've done for the last 2 years. And I've seen the numbers sort of slowly rise, which is a good thing. We kind of want to be aware that these tools can hallucinate. And I'll talk about what that means later on for those that aren't aware. But it's a very important limitation with these products. I guess I'll alternate between calling them tools and products. It's sort of hard to know where to pinpoint them. So the Gen AI journey so far, I mean, there's way too much to cover really in the space of 2 years to do this justice. But this is kind of like a broad strokes attempt at what has been a pretty chaotic kind of continual update of AI tools, applications, what it all means. As I mentioned, we had ChatGPT 3.5 come out. People like myself played around with it. Turnitin released its AI detector. I guess that was pretty big news to me as an educator, so I put that in there. Then ChatGPT 4 was released, and we started to see an improvement in the model, so a large improvement. Some were kind of unsure whether there was an actual improvement, but it soon turned out that there was an actual improvement. But we'll get to whether or not ChatGPT 4 is the ChatGPT 4 once was. February, Sora releases its, we're kind of jumping quite a bit there, but a lot happened in between that time, believe me. But Sora releases its AI generated video. So some of you might have seen footage of what it was capable of. The text to video prompts that it's able to do are quite astonishing. It's not publicly released. They just showed footage of what they could do. There was a recent website just posted the other day, actually, called Luma, which is a similar sort of Sora alternative, not quite as capable, but still the text to video creation is quite astonishing. We had Suno. Has anyone had a chance to play around with Suno or Udio, any of the music AI generators? They tend to be quite I guess they kind of, when I've demoed them to audiences, they tend to see the kind of, I guess the real the power of generative AI and what it's capable of. It's large language models tend to not really excite many people. We all know what they do, but when people see what a tool like Udio or Suno can do in terms of generating music from a prompt, it sort of surprises people that generative AI is capable of that. There's also the recent announcement of Apple, which this is like peak ubiquity now. Soon we're going to have AI, ChatGPT, basically integrated in iOS devices. Everyone that has an iPhone in their pocket will have access to the world's most powerful large language model. So from a kind of unknown, virtually unknown, apart from like people in the AI research area, tool becoming one of the most popular apps we've seen, to something that's going to be in all of our pockets very soon. We can sort of see that it has kind of been embraced by the world, by many, but also, as we'll see, others have chosen not to embrace it. And it appears to be, well, it doesn't appear to be, there is a divide, I would say, between those that have like quite passionately choosing not to use it for good reason, and those that are adopting it in their workflow because it helps them and they get a lot of use out of it. I'm not going to try and convince you of any position today. I'm just going to sort of present what has been covered and what we know, and hopefully you can kind of make up your own mind. But yeah, there's just not enough time to do that anyways. So this is the hype cycle. The sort of, if you're familiar with Gartner's hype cycle, we're kind of in the middle of this trough of disillusionment at the moment. It peaked around, when ChatGPT 4 was released. But at the moment, as we'll see, it's questionable as to whether or not these tools are getting any better. So they've kind of sort of pitted out. Whereas for a long time, they were growing exponentially. They were growing at a rate that we were kind of, it was unprecedented. We saw for months the image generation of hands was very odd and distorted, and yet in a few months these image generation tools were capable of generating hands that looked great. They looked normal. They looked fine. So it was very interesting to see the improvements being made. Whereas now we're wondering whether or not we're actually going to get a sort of ChatGPT 5 sort of update that would be worthy of that title. So we'll see how things are going, but we're definitely in this slope at the moment. Okay, so this is a sort of an explanation of large language models. And I guess what I'm about to demo to you guys is, because I can't really explain how large language models work, I'm not a computer scientist. I basically custom built a GPT, which sounds like, I don't know if it even sounds clever, but it's not. It's really easy to design a custom GPT. You don't need any coding experience. You just basically tell it what to do and it will kind of do it for you. I encourage people to actually use custom GPTs to get a sense of how these tools work and how large language models like think, quote unquote. I fed it a bunch of my old lectures, workshops, transcripts, and then I asked it to write in my style, using ums and ahs and things, and then it spat out this description of large language models. I'm going to play it in a second. I then used 11 Labs, which is like a voice cloning tool, and if some of you are nodding your heads, you're probably familiar with it. I actually went ahead and bought the subscription for the month, so I've been spending a lot of money on these tools. I've really got to stop. I was going to go one step further. There's actually ones that actually generate images of you and video footage of you talking, but they were like, way too expensive. And so I gave it my voice. I gave it my like recordings, actual recordings. You need to give like 30 minutes of like a good recording. And it produced, a voice clone. So this is me, hopefully this works, explaining how LLMs work. Again, I didn't say this. I didn't record this. This is just a generation of the AI tool. Language models such as GPT-4 utilize the transformer architecture, which employs attention mechanisms to process and generate human-like text. They're trained on vast text data sets, which are tokenized into smaller units for the model to process. The training involves adjusting the weights of neurons through forward and backward passes, allowing the model to learn language patterns and context. Attention mechanisms enable the model to focus on relevant parts of the input text, enhancing context and coherence in the output. LLMs are fine-tuned for specific applications and excel in generating coherent text, summarizing information and translation, although they can sometimes produce incorrect or nonsensical outputs. So that was weird. And also, Why I would say like you could tell it's not me, but also like you can tell that it sounds a lot like me, right? Like, and that is a kind of maybe a concern. I don't know. I'm sort of, apart from kind of demoing the capabilities of what generative AI can do, I'm yet to see the sort of positives of that kind of feature. I don't see how I'd implement that in my workflow or my research activities. Although I have found it useful as a side note for listening to stories that I've written. So I'll give the tool stories that I've written to hear the words read from my voice as a way to edit through them. But other than that, I don't know. Like, why do we need this? I mean, it could potentially, hopefully doesn't, but replace teachers and educators one day when they become very capable. I hope that never happens. But it's hard to not see people going that route given the sort of ubiquity of these tools. This is the HeyGen version of me. This is the free version. Again, not paying any subscriptions anymore. I need to stop. And so this is what I added the audio to the video, and it sort of lip syncs. So you'll just have a watch of this and just see what you think. Language models such as GPT-4 utilize the transformer architecture, which employs attention mechanisms to process and generate human-like text. They're trained on vast text data sets, which are tokenized into smaller units for the model to process. The training involves adjusting the weights of neurons. All right, well, we won't look at it anymore. So it's not quite there yet. You could kind of tell it was obviously not real, but I mean, these things are happening very fast. These tools are coming out and they're developing and they're improving. I mean, it's hard not to imagine a world where these aren't everywhere. These are sort of deep fakes. And so obviously one of the ethical concerns is what that means for political campaigns, what that means for media and news outlets. There's all sorts of dangers here where basically anything on the internet now is kind of even more questionable. Even video, which was once considered sort of more safe, you would argue. So it kind of leaves us in this, I don't know how to feel about it. You know, AI, if it can write, if it can research, if it can grade, what's the point of universities? What's the point in doing what we do? And I think that's a really important question. I think we still have a purpose and a value proposition to make. And in fact, I think these tools sort of highlight what the value proposition that we offer is. But to kind of just bring the air back in the room a little bit, I'll just quickly show you this video. This is an ad that was run for Cadbury. So I'll let this play out.
This new AI can perform all coding jobs in seconds, including blockchain development. While this AI is already outperforming accounting firms. Meanwhile, the new graphic design AI aims to automate graphic design and could minimize the need.
Relax. Because in a future where AI does most of the work, there'll be one thing that humans will finally get to do all day long. Nothing. So it's time to learn the most essential skill of the future. 5-Star presents Nothing University with the first ever diploma program in doing nothing. An intensive course covering the most future-ready skills out there.
Well, let me check with the AI and get back to you in a few days.
With our state-of-the-art workshops, campus placements, and guest lectures, the world can finally prepare for the glorious future that awaits us. Eat 5-Star, do nothing. Enroll now.
Okay, so we're kind of at a sort of a ditch at the moment with the purpose of universities and why we exist. And do we want AI to do all the work for us? I don't think we do. I don't think that's why we come to university. I don't think that's why we teach and why we learn. And I don't think that's why we research. But that ad sort of does draw our attention to, you know, a world where AI does everything, which is obviously a world we kind of want to avoid. So this is an interesting trick you can do with ChatGPT. You can try this at home. Simply asking it, how many letters are in a particular word will often get you a result like this. And there's a reason for that. And that's partly because these tools look for tokens and not necessarily letters in a word. But you can see there are limitations with these tools. There are vast limitations. Today, I'm going to talk about the potential of these tools as well. So there will be some positive elements, and I will be talking about the possibilities of them in the future, because I do think there's a space for these in our work for some. But for those that are choosing not to use them, that's completely valid as well. So I will explore some of the positives, but there are many limitations. Did anyone see the Google and AI integration? I mean, I'm surprised that they didn't at least vet this before releasing it. For those that aren't familiar, Google integrated into its search bar a sort of AI feature which allowed you to learn more. My mom actually rang me up really concerned about this. And yeah, someone asked it how many rocks shall I eat a day? And it said, well, you should at least eat one small rock per day, according to geologists at UC Berkeley. Another asked, how can I avoid pizza sliding from, or cheese sliding from pizza? And someone suggested using non-toxic glue to avoid that. So we can see the kind of the limitations. I mean, they're pretty obvious. And partly that's because ChatGPT is bullshit. We don't actually, it doesn't think for itself. It doesn't know what it's saying. It is a bullshit generator. And that's its limitation. This paper was published quite recently, actually, so you can have a look and read that later on. So in terms of why we should bother, and I think this is sort of my message for today, is that we should bother because the world needs us. It needs us as researchers. It needs our minds. It needs our quirks and our individuality in order to, bring to the world what others couldn't. And if we give more of AI to that process, I think we sort of remove the value that we actually bring. I know that sounds very kind of like public speaking sort of coach advice, but it's something that I really do believe. I think we come to university to give something of ourselves, and it's important that we don't offload too much of that to artificial intelligence. So ChatGPT is mildly embarrassing at best. GPT-4 is the dumbest model any of you will ever have to use again by a long shot. So this is Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, which owns ChatGPT, basically saying that the most powerful model in the world is currently in the dumbest stage it'll ever be. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not ChatGPT-5 is going to be a huge improvement. It's said to have multimodal features, which would include text to video, text to audio, like things like Sora. So there's a lot of suggested, I guess, potential there, but we're sort of yet to see it. And some are saying that we've kind of reached a peak with what these large language models can actually do. Recently, the Mira Murati, who is the CTO of OpenAI, she kind of went on the record and publicly said that the models that they have available in the public, aren't that much better than ChatGPT, or ChatGPT isn't that much better than those that are in the public sphere. So really, reduce the kind of value that they bring. A lot of people cancel their subscriptions because of that. So is ChatGPT that good? That's the question we have to ask. I do want to point out that, and I'll get to the research stuff soon, but Sam Altman is very, he has his eyes set on universities. He tweeted this. I constantly, I post this every year at least, when OpenAI and education starts to come about. He says that US colleges are nearer to collapsing than ever before. This is in March 2022. We look to May 30th, 2024. They introduced ChatGPT in education. What does that mean? I don't really know. I read the website and it doesn't really offer much in terms of what that looks like, but you can tell that these companies have their eyes set on universities and the creation of knowledge. So it's good to be aware of that. It's not all doom and gloom. I think that, they can do what they will, but it does sort of make us think about what our value is and how we can actually improve the world with our research. So the robots are coming. These tools are being embraced. OpenAI's ChatGPT was the fastest growing app in history, 100 million users in it was less than a month. And so they're ubiquitous now. They're here, and we have them to either work with them or work against them. There's no banning them. There's no getting rid of them. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle, which is a metaphor I hate saying. But they're out there, and I think our best bet is to kind of think about what they can and can't do, and to be aware of the kind of dangers of using them. It's not all doom and gloom though. There are some potentials. So we'll talk about some of the potentials now. So I actually wanted these to come up separately, but they didn't. So you'll have to. There's going to be a dramatic like who was the best, but I put Grammarly Go at the bottom because I haven't actually used Grammarly Go. Has anyone used Grammarly Go out of interest, the AI version? Okay, cool. So I'd be interested to see how that works because it does have AI capabilities. But in terms of AI tools for writing, Gen AI tools for writing. So again, I've spent a lot of time over the last few years experimenting with these tools and seeing what they can and can't do. And I've sort of ranked them in terms of what I think are sort of, capabilities. There are actually official leaderboards that you can go and look at online if you wanted to actually see official, stances. This is just my take. Copilot is pretty good. It can verify sources and it tends to hallucinate less. If you use Copilot in creative mode or balanced, there's three options: creative, balanced, and precise. Creative and balanced gives you it accesses ChatGPT 4's large language model. So it's the more advanced version. How it accesses it though is a bit kind of, we're not quite sure, because I find comparing ChatGPT 4 to say Copilot, there's a discrepancy there. They're not quite as capable. I find Copilot's not quite as capable. But it's really good sometimes for certain things, and definitely coming up with sources and actually giving reference for what it's saying. I put ChatGPT up there as it kind of just before Claude, which I'll talk about. I think ChatGPT is a great all-rounder. It can do all sorts of things if you have a subscription. There's data analysis features. There's the writing it produces is pretty good in terms of quality. Google's Gemini, I would say, is quite powerful as well. Perplexity is one that I've recently been trying, and there's a lot of interesting features it can do, particularly for research. Claude, however, I really like Claude in terms of its output, partly because it sounds more human generated, and it's really good at coming up with sort of more humanities-based text, which is of interest to me. In terms of research tools, however, there are quite a few that you can all try, and I'll show you some of the capabilities today. But Elicit is probably my favorite, although it does require a subscription. Is anyone familiar with Elicit by any chance? Yeah, some of the cool things about Elicit are that you can actually create custom columns, so you can search papers according to, I guess, the limitations of the papers or the methodologies of the papers, whatever kind of column you want to make. And the sort of user experience of Elicit is quite interesting because it presents things as a kind of literature review matrix. It sort of formats things in a way that is easier to navigate and presents the research to you. We'll talk about the limitations in a minute, though. I guess, yeah, Elicit is also interesting because, again, these research tools, some of them are AI research tools and some of them are Gen AI research tools. Some of these tools generate text, others don't. So they're not all generative AI tools. Elicit, however, one of the kind of, I guess the problems with it is it does need to have to pay for it, and the tokens are limited. The summaries, yeah, we'll talk about the dangers of the summaries and things in a minute, but often the summaries can be wrong. Perplexity, again, good for research. Consensus is really good. It isn't trained on the internet. These tools aren't trained on the internet. They're trained on journal articles and databases. Many of them use Semantic Scholar, if you're familiar with that. These are over, like 260 million research articles that they're actually trained on, that they're drawing knowledge from. They're not scraping the internet. They're not looking at Reddit and Facebook for information. These tools are looking at what's been published. Kenius, I really like Kenius. So if you're kind of anti-AI or you're not really using AI or not sure about AI, Kenius is an interesting one because it doesn't actually generate text. It's a bit more of a niche sort of tool. But what it actually does is it allows you to add text that you've written, and then it will use natural language processing to find relevant articles according to the text that you've generated or the text that you've created. And often those articles are actually quite relevant to what you've just written. So you might not have the sources to back up what you're saying just yet. You might just be fleshing out some ideas. This will help you find sources to investigate those ideas further. and it doesn't generate text. It just finds you sources. These aren't hallucinated sources, by the way. These are sources that you can click on, go through, and access via libkey. So I put Jenny and Cite a bit lower because I find the concern, I have some concerns about Jenny and Cite, particularly the fact that Jenny and Cite like to generate text for you. They will actually allow you to insert references. They'll allow you to add sources with just the click of a button. And as a kind of educator, I guess that sort of concerns me a little bit for students. It's very easy to now produce fairly polished, referenced essays that are relevant and that have sources in them without having to do much other than prompt. And so, yeah, these tools are kind of interesting. Funnily enough, UNSW does have a subscription to Cite, so you can actually access it and use it for better or worse. I put ChatGPT quite low on the list because as far as research goes, it's really bad at doing research. I wouldn't use ChatGPT at all for looking for articles. Like if you ask it to find the top 10 articles in my research field, A, it will hallucinate, and B, that won't be the top 10 articles in your research field. But it will sound like that they are. Has anyone used any of the bottom ones for research? I haven't used Claude for research, although I've used Claude for writing. But has anyone used Semantic Scholar or Research Rabbit? Actually, I'd be really interested to see. So Research Rabbit, I've heard, is really good at seeing the kind of a visual image of the field. And for some, that's actually quite helpful. So these are the tools that exist. I've included a link to them all on the slide so you can access the slides later and click through them. But there are some positives. So there are people using artificial intelligence for academic writing and research. This paper here talks about, how it's useful for idea development and brainstorming and all that sort of stuff. The development of structure, the development of content, synthesizing sources, editing, and reviewing. So there is kind of many people using them for good. How I use it for writing, I think it's good to create basic outlines to build upon. Kind of gives you a start to sort of base off and then go from there. It's really good at simplifying complex sentences. So something I find, there's usually 1 or 2 sentences a day that I just really struggle with when I'm writing. And it might be, I will say, I don't like integrating AI into my writing. That's something I try to kind of leave separate as a creative writer. When I'm writing academic papers, I'm a little more lenient on having AI help me uncomplicate a really complex sentence. If it's too long and long-winded, I might get it to sort of just simplify it and see what it does. And then I'll look at that simplification and see if it's improved it or not. And often that process helps me sort of stop from getting stuck. So I enjoy using it for that reason. It's also really good at explaining complex ideas in ways that are easier to understand. So often it can, if you use the prompt, explain to me like I'm 12, which is a really useful prompt to just really simplify stuff. It'll do a pretty good job of doing that. Better than some of my old lecturers. So coming up with research questions and ideas for titles, presentations. It didn't come up with this presentation title, although it does sound quite AI generated. But I suck at presentation titles. And so I often will get it to do that for me. Okay, look, research questions. I mean, it kind of takes the fun out of coming out with a research question if you get ChatGPT to do it. But in saying that, I suck at coming up with research questions. And I like to see what it would think of a research question would be good to explore. I've rarely used, I don't think I've ever used a research question that ChatGPT has come up with, but it has led to me creating my own, and it's helped that process. So in terms of like autonomous learning and working, having something there with you as you work, I think there's some really positive use cases. As far as work in terms of unethical use, and I've been working a lot with UNSW in terms of the, I designed the referencing guide that we use, and also the, I'll talk about it in a minute, but the one-page slider some of you might have seen about responsible AI use. But in terms of what stands to be, what is unethical use of AI? Like, it's a really big question. And there were no real answers in 2022 when these tools are sort of just coming out. We're kind of all unsure, like, what does unethical use look like? I spent a few months just literally walking along the beach thinking, how am I going to write this referencing guide? How do I expect students to reference AI? Like, what does that even look like? How can AI be a source? And I realized one day that actually nothing has really changed. The first principles are there. I feel if you're going to copy paste information that ChatGPT has produced, you should reference that. There should be a reference for that. And the reason there should be a reference for that is because it's not your work. So I think it's important to kind of consider how we reference these tools, and when you choose to reference them or when you don't choose to reference them. For students, I think it's a little different. I think for researchers, it's kind of slightly, it depends on your discretion. But I think we sort of should have a right to know what we're reading when it has been generated and when it's been written by a human. I'll talk about the sort of the principles that apply to referencing in a minute. A good way to think of it is like the Wikipedia principle, which I'll explain shortly. Yeah, it also allows you to significantly alter your work. So if you do let AI significantly alter your work, then I think there's an ethical issue. And using ChatGPT as a source of high quality information isn't going to be good either. So in terms of acknowledging the use of AI, the Wikipedia principle is really useful, I find. So when Wikipedia first came out, again, people were freaking out about it's the end of education and students are going to cheat and, oh no, what are we going to do? It didn't really, change the world much. In fact, I think Wikipedia has come a long way and is actually now one of the better things the internet has produced. But in saying that, the way that we cite Wikipedia is that we sort of don't, right? Like in academic writing, we might use it. We'll go to it as a guide. It might be when we're coming to terms with a new idea. And then we'll go to the references that it uses, refer to those, vet them, and then ideally cite those or not and look further into the topic. We don't cite Wikipedia. And I think it's the same principle applies to referencing AI. We don't cite the ChatGPT, although there's ways of doing it. So I guess that's sort of something to consider is if you're putting large portions of AI generated text into your work, that is questionable. We're talking about there are a lot of papers that were redacted and particularly in medical journals for having AI generated text within them. Things like, I'm sorry, I'm a large language model, I can't help with that, were actually included in the papers. So it does happen. And that kind of shows you, that's the fact that they were redacted shows a kind of general sense of where journals are at with their sort of feelings towards AI in research. So I think it's useful as a guide. It's coming to terms with things. I don't really like to see it in the text that I'm reading though, if it's of value. But there are times where perhaps maybe going full AI would be acceptable, like a really boring corporate email or something like that. Okay, so let's look at some of the pitfalls. So in terms of illicit, again, this is a tool that you need to pay for, so there's limitations to it, but you can access it for a month. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't, it's quite easy to use. It is a simple onboarding process. It's not hard. It's designed to be user-friendly. So you can quickly jump on there and start using it. Although they do admit, if you look sort of further into their limitations on their website, it does they state themselves that this tool is 80 to 90% accurate, not 100% accurate. So I think that's a good sort of, I guess, way of thinking about these research tools. They're 80 to 90% accurate. So that means that you can't rely on them. If you're going to use them, you have to vet what they're outputting, right? You have to verify the information that they provide. Ethical considerations. Now, I think in terms of, again, the pitfalls, there are quite a few. You're probably aware of all the stuff that's happening at the moment in terms of intellectual property. The last time I gave this talk for this faculty, there was the institute, sorry, was the writers' strikes in Hollywood. They were a big thing. We now have issues with data and privacy. Adobe recently announced that, and then they quickly redacted it, but that they were going to train their models on people's content that they created using Adobe. And lots of people quickly pulled out of Adobe, and then Adobe sort of changed their minds and said, no, sorry, we'll take that back. We won't train, ourselves on your data. So there's lots of privacy and data concerns. And if you're using Copilot and you're signed in, your data is kept safe. So it's not, the large language model isn't using your information to train its outputs. And this is really important. If you're wanting to publish research, you're looking to, get, ideas out there, putting in your work into a public facing large language model isn't a great idea, especially ChatGPT. If you put your material through those tools, they could essentially be training, and they do. They train themselves on your inputs. So if your ideas are novel or original, they could actually end up in other people's outputs. So other people's ChatGPT responses. So unless you're using Copilot or tools where the privacy is ensured, Microsoft is sort of known for its safety features. So it's sort of, we can kind of, I guess, hopefully trust them, whereas other places maybe not as much. Like I question whether or not having ChatGPT in private mode is actually protecting my data. I really don't trust OpenAI very much, to be honest. But in terms of Microsoft and being signed into Copilot, you can be fairly sure that whatever you put in there isn't being used to train itself. So in terms of bias and hallucinations, I mean, we saw early on the dangers of this. Google Gemini's image generator pulled their tool off the shelves because of all the bias within its image generation. I think the bias in these tools reveals themselves a lot more in image generation than it does in text. It's quite obvious the sort of the differences there and how it sort of highlights. And we also obviously have, the dangers of hallucinations. Some are now saying that hallucinations aren't actually the best word, though, because it suggests that these tools are, I guess, conscious or they can think because they're hallucinating, but they're not thinking. There's nothing going on behind the hood there. Unless you're sort of Blake Lemoine and you've looked into that sort of sentient idea of AI, which has been highly refuted, but some believe. He actually sort of thought that large language models were sentient and sort of talks about that a lot. But they're not. Confabulations is sort of a term that's come about now instead of hallucinations. So I don't know if that's ever going to take on. It's a bit of a mouthful, but and to be honest, it doesn't really matter. They make stuff up. They bullshit, and so we have to kind of be aware of that. The environmental impact as well. And again, I mean, there should be a lecture on each one of these. These topics you will have to explore further. I can't really do them all justice in an hour. But the environmental impact is quite significant. They say it's over a gallon of water for 30 outputs that ChatGPT provides to cool the servers within the within OpenAI. So, I mean, that's a pretty large impact if you think of each individual using these tools. Some have actually said that the amount of time it would spend to actually write the text would end up using more resources than getting ChatGPT to output it, but I don't know if the logic is quite there for that. The human displacement factor. I mean, we've already seen some job displacement they're happening, which probably leads into mental health and well-being. For those that actually aren't familiar, there's a really great voice within UNSW that's talking about the mental health and well-being aspects of AI, Professor Joel Pearson. So he's actually quite profound in terms of these sort of thinking about these ideas, which I don't think many people are actually talking about. So if you check his stuff out, he's written a book on intuition as well, which is quite interesting. He's a neuroscientist, so he has a lot to say about this stuff. Okay, so can AI-generated text be reliably detected? This has been widely reported that it cannot. We can't tell if AI text has been generated. It just simply doesn't work. In fact, OpenAI had their AI generator or detector. These are the people that created ChatGPT, and it wasn't able to tell when something generated text accurately enough. So they pulled it off the shelves again. Lots of pulling off the shelves in this industry. But with trying to detect, we simply can't. And yet we do use Turnitin. We use Turnitin at UNSW to determine whether or not someone's work has been written by them or AI. Funnily enough, these AI detectors will also come and flag the US Bill of Rights is 100% AI generated. They will come up and tell you that parts of the Bible were AI generated. All sorts of things. You can give it papers that were published in 1990 and it will say that they're AI generated. I actually wrote something for I forget what it was. It was something very boring, like in academic integrity module or something. And the document that I wrote, it was 2 pages. It came up as 100% AI generated. I didn't know whether to be proud or ashamed of that, but it was, so these tools don't actually, reliably detect, and yet we're sort of using them as a kind of a piece of evidence in the kind of, I guess, determining what is and isn't. I think you can kind of, here's the thing I do tell educators though, I think it's important to realize, yes, you can sometimes tell when what you're reading has been generated by AI. It has that sort of that feeling to it, right? We've all read something that's AI generated and it sounds AI generated. But we can't always tell. We can't always tell. So we often will read things that have been AI generated and we were none the wiser. So that's it. That's something I often have to say. They did tests on humans' ability to detect AI generated text, and they did really poorly. So we're not as good as we think we are. Although we can spot it, it's not, we're not as thorough. The other problem and challenge with AI generators is that they're actually discriminatory towards non-native speakers of English, and that's partly because of a number of reasons, which I'll talk about. But it's a huge problem that these tools have. They actually do favor and will flag students that have English as an additional language as having AI-generated written text. So how AI detection works, I'm just going to cover this very briefly because it gives you an idea of how these tools work. AI detection is very easy to bypass, and I mean, it's not hard. The lower in complexity, the more likely it is that it's AI, and the higher in complexity, the more likely it is to be human. By complexity, we mean unpredictability. So large language models are basically just looking at what is most likely the next word in a sentence. They're predicting what is most likely the next word in a sentence. And so the more complex that sentence, the less likely it is to be AI. So it's kind of easy to bypass these detectors, by the way, and you can test whether or not something has been AI generated with free websites. I actually got ChatGPT 3.5 to write something, and then I had ChatGPT 4 write something, and then I had it test it as to whether or not it was AI generated. So ChatGPT 3.5, this came up as 100% AI generated. ChatGPT 4, a much succinct, more succinct paragraph, the same prompt, 100% AI generated. With the prompting, make this text more perplex and with higher burstiness, 0% AI generated. So, and again, like these aren't really, they're not tricky hacks. It's quite easy to do this. And in fact, we'll talk about the sort of AI influencers on Instagram flooding my feed at the moment, promoting tools to students to sort of cheat. But yeah, it's quite easy to get around these tools. So my suggestion, the thing that's hilarious about this is they grayed out background, right, in the text. If you ever copy and paste something from ChatGPT, it will have the grayed out background. And that's exactly what this student has done and not seen. So I will often tell students, if you are publishing or if you're even writing a PhD, to keep you have to keep drafts of your work saved now, which you will do anyway. If you're using Word or even Google Docs, there is a track history thing. It'll check and record all the changes you've made, so they'll naturally be there. But it is a good practice now. We're in the age where we have to keep drafts of our work saved. These are the AI influencers. So again, probably because I started liking these videos or bookmarking them for research purposes, they've flooded my Instagram feed. But there's people now encouraging students to basically cheat with ChatGPT and giving them hacks and all sorts of tools and tips of avoiding learning, which is fun. So possibilities. What are the possibilities? That's a really important question, I think, that we could all probably consider. I'd be interested to hear from the audience later what they think the possibilities are in their field. I can definitely share mine. In terms of doing this justice, though, it's really hard to kind of talk much about what hasn't already been said, but I would direct you to these three books here, and I'll talk about the middle one in a second. So Ethan Mollick, he's been quite a popular voice in the space of AI tools in education and what they mean, living and working with AI. If anyone's familiar with this book, it's probably the most well-known book on this subject. He's definitely more of a kind of pro-AI person. Not that I like to put people in those sorts of categories, but he writes a lot about working with AI and what it means for daily practice. So that's definitely worth exploring. It's actually a good book. Salman Khan, who is the founder of Khan Academy, I wouldn't recommend you read his book, partly because it reads like an infomercial for AI that's 200 pages long. And the fact that he's called it Brave New Words, I'm not sure if he's aware of the reference there. I mean, if you had read Brave New Worlds, you would know that that's not a good comparison to make. But I wonder, maybe perhaps ChatGPT came up with that title or something. I don't know. But yeah, that's not a good book to read. But if you want to see what AI hype looks like, that's the book. Atlas of AI is a bit more critical, and it's sort of a bit more of a kind of humanities-based approach, but still quite interesting. So yeah, these are sort of 3 books you might want to consider for looking into the sort of possibilities. Which, yeah. Conclusion. So, I mean, whether or not you feel like confident with these tools, whether or not, I mean, it sounds like most of you are using them now, so you're all pretty familiar with them, which is things have clearly shifted. I think it's good to sort of, they say to get your 5 hours in, get your 5 hours of use in, see what the tools can and can't do, see what their limitations are, see what they're capable of, where they might help you, and choose to use them in whatever capacity you would like. I don't really think it's important to kind of determine who does and doesn't use these tools. I know many students getting a lot out of it, and I know many that choose not to use it actively, and that's great for both of them. A good way to think of these tools, though, is of a drunk assistant. So they get it right some of the time, but not all the time. So it's not a supervisor, right? You can't vet everything that it says. If you get one thing from this workshop, it has to be verify every output. It's got to be verified. You can't rely on it until it's verified. And think about what AI can't do, right? What is it incapable of? And then do that. And I think that's how we sort of bring a value proposition to the public and to the university. So I think I'll end there. But if there are any questions from the audience, I'll be really interested to hear them.
So yeah, before we actually get into those questions, I think, so when James had done this seminar to the students last year, a lot of that content has changed. Lots of AI has just been rapidly changing in the last few months, even in a year. And it was always kind of like a tricky spot of when we should try to talk about this stuff. But remembering that this is kind of the start of a conversation and we're going to see how this is going to progress. But yeah, I think that was a great presentation. I'm really excited to talk more about it. I guess we'll start off with this. The first one on the bottom: can ethical use of AI in papers be detected, even in the false ethical use of AI? Do we have to acknowledge the use of AI? I wanted to add a little bit on that detection part. I don't know if you read that paper that showed there's a French computer scientist that was looking at tortured phrases. So the concept that AI, when you ask AI to generate something, there's some very standard phrases in technical writing that it will substitute for something else. So an example would be, instead of big data, it comes up with colossal information. Or instead of heavy metal, it's substantial metal. I don't know if you have any thoughts on if the detection of AI is going to get any better in the future, or if it's always just going to have the same pitfalls that it'll never really be perfectly detectable.
I mean, if anyone can invent a tool that can detect AI, they'll probably become a billionaire, because I don't know if it's actually possible. Statistically, it's like, if you think about the infinite possibilities of language and putting words together, the idea of being able to detect whether or not a human wrote something, it seems like we're pretty far from that. Like Turnitin does claim to have gotten to a sort of quite a high rate of consistency with its tool, but we know that it's the way that they kind of tested their tool is on a sort of their own repository of essays and its own sort of database. So its sort of results are questionable. And we've seen products like OpenAI's AI detector remove themselves because they don't actually work. So I don't think we're there yet. Maybe one day. I mean, if you want to try and invent that, go for it. But I don't think, we're there at the moment.
I'll have a question. So thanks for the talk. I guess you focus very much on the writing aspect and I guess words, but I guess from my side, I'm a quantitative person. So interested in the tools used for extracting numbers, or like an illicit type thing that can pull all the numbers from all the papers it's read and maybe do something with those numbers. I mean, are you aware of tools heading in that direction?
Yeah, so I don't really work a lot with numbers because I'm a humanities person, but the tool within ChatGPT, its data analysis is quite good at like looking at spreadsheets and Excel sheets and extracting data from that and creating tables and graphs and things like that. Which is it's sort of, I mean, questionable as to how good it is, but people are using that for like qualitative studies and things, and then vetting those results. But that can be quite useful if you've used that. If you tried using data analysis, I think you need a subscription to ChatGPT, which I'd recommend everyone tries for at least a month. If you haven't already tried actually, I don't know if I should say that anymore. I don't. So I'm fairly certain. I will go on the record as saying I'm fairly certain that ChatGPT 4 has diminished in quality since the release of ChatGPT 4o, which is the sort of more multimodal version. And I've noticed that because I've spent a lot of time using ChatGPT, and I've spent a lot of time creating custom GPTs and seeing what they can and can't do and fine-tuning them and improving them. And just all the custom GPTs I've created aren't working as well anymore. And the responses I'm getting from ChatGPT aren't as good as they once were. So I think once they've opened it up to like free use or the public, and others have sort of felt the same way, the results have gotten like worse. So I don't think it's as good anymore. I think in terms of like it's much quicker. I'll give it that. But I don't think it's as capable anymore. So yeah, it's interesting. Other question.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I guess something I've been thinking about is it does seem, recently in the last couple of years, there's been this explosion and acceleration in, AI, but for years before we had this recently, there were people who were talking about how AI was coming and people who were starting to worry about, what would be an ethical use of AI or what the guardrails should be. But it seems that that's, I don't know if I'm just not seeing it, but it doesn't seem that that's really part of the conversation at the moment. And I've been listening to a bunch of podcasts and people are just not talking about it. So I wondered if you've got any impressions about that.
Yeah, like the ethical implications of AI in general, or what we're doing about them. Do you mean, or?
I mean, I guess the conversations hadn't really developed enough until we had the recent explosion for me to really understand what it was. But I think there was stuff around, trying to avoid unsafe use of AI. I'm not sure if people really fully anticipated how it would develop, but just in general, there was a concern about making sure that how it was used would be done in an ethical way.
Right. Yeah. I see your point. Yeah. I guess the way that it did it exploded onto the scene, I guess you could say. Like it came out of nowhere. Like there were people that are aware of these large language models being developed, and there was ChatGPT like 2 and 3, but they were never really that impressive. So we kind of just dismissed them. And then all of a sudden 3.5 comes out and it's like, wow, these things are actually pretty impressive, because they are impressive. Like there's no doubt about it. So I guess what we're seeing is the ethics are kind of, we're sort of riding by the seat of our pants. Like in terms of long-term negative impacts of AI in our world, we don't yet know. That's where I would suggest looking into Joel Pearson's work, the neuroscientist from UNSW. He's done a lot of good podcasts and written a book on this stuff as well. But he has a lot to say about the potential impacts. Like if you think about deep fakes, the ability to just make images and videos of people and clone their voice, like you saw me do. Like what impact would that have on like a teenage girl growing up? To see like a deep fake of her somewhere out there on the internet. So there's all sorts of ethical concerns that you would have to question the existence of these tools at all, given those concerns, but we still have them. And it's tough. Like it's hard. Like I use ChatGPT. I use these tools, and I'm aware of the ethical limitations and the dangers and the environmental impacts and the bias and the hallucinations, and sort of yet continue to use them because they're sort of there. And I mean, I know there are people that are choosing not to use them because of the ethical reasons, and that's their choice. And perhaps maybe I'll one day be them. I don't know. But for now I'm using it, and I think it's useful, and it's helped my practice, and I've seen it help students practice. And I think there are good and bad uses for sure. But the ethics is it's an ongoing discussion. And I think we'll have to kind of, really work on implementing things rather than just talking about them, for sure.
If you have more questions in the room, you can line up at the mic, but I'll just take a couple from online. So we're actually talking about this earlier about theses, about whether or not are there any kind of implications of using these large language models for thesis writing. Do you have any thoughts or guidance on what the uni would say about that?
Yeah, so I wonder if it's in my slides. I don't think I've got them here. The ethical use of AI is something that is, like, I guess, considered in terms of editing. So for those that have, we used to have, you could pay a ghostwriter or you could pay a person to proofread your thesis, right? And that was acceptable. But there were certain things they couldn't do. The ghostwriter or the thesis editor wasn't allowed to substantially change the structure or the content. Obviously, that would be going beyond the limit. And I would say the same would go for an AI tool. We wouldn't want it going beyond and changing substantially our work and the structure and the content. So I think in terms of, the best practice is to always check with the supervisor and what they think is good use, and what they deem as, how you can or can't use these tools. But I had it on my slides, but I think it's hidden. The iPad guidelines, which is basically what is used for determining your use of like copy editing services. It talks about the intervention of copy editing and proofreading, and I think it's interesting to apply that to sort of AI and how we use AI. So if AI is going beyond the sort of standards of what a thesis editor would do, then that's probably going beyond the standards of what you should be doing with it. But yeah, that's probably definitely a question for the supervisor as well.
Yeah, thanks. So a question from Paul. I'll truncate this a little bit, but one of the last things that you kind of said in a little table is focus on what ChatGPT can't do and then do that. Do you have any thoughts on how researchers can, remain relevant when, like Paul said, you can ask ChatGPT to do something that would normally take a research assistant a couple of hours of work to do. You just punch it out in a large language model.
Yeah, I think in terms of like relevancy, like AI can't read, it can't understand, it doesn't have reasoning. So we still need to read and understand and reason. We still need to actually read research articles and think about what they mean and critique and evaluate them. We can't outsource that information. We can't outsource that labor. We don't want a world flooded with AI generated material, right? We want an AI flooded with human generated material. Perhaps AI has been used in some ways in that process, but I think it's important not to kind of get lost and have, a proliferation of just AI everything. Because then it does beg the question, what is the point of university? What is the point of doing research? What is the point? Like, why do research if you're just going to outsource everything? Like, where's the fun in that? So I think, it's in terms of like, the job replacement stuff, that's a challenging one. I don't even know how to unpack that. I guess we'll see. But question over at the mic.
Yeah, hi, thanks for a great presentation. I want to ask you a really practical question from the point of view of an academic who reviews a lot of students' theses. And so we have a lot of people from non-English speaking backgrounds, and we have a lot of English speaking people who didn't learn grammar properly when they were young. Is there anything wrong with using Microsoft Copilot and putting in your paper and saying, tidy up the grammar in this, write this as if I were a native English speaker, something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good, thank you for the practical question. That's a really, really good question. So I work a lot with students that have English as an additional language, and have been for a number of years. And one of the interesting things, I was sort of I guess I'm still a bit of a proponent. I'm cautiously optimistic about how they can integrate it into their research and their writing. And I think in terms of a student using it, what we do find is it actually can, in some ways, take away their voice. It can take away the quality of what they've said. So when they try to say, I've had students write in their first language, translate that directly into using a large language model, and then submit that. The material that these large language models develop, it removes the authenticity. It removes the kind of the authorial voice within the text. It's really important, and often says things that they didn't mean to say. In the same way, though, there are potential benefits of having it help understand things like grammar and to go through a thesis and look for edits and find, you know, inconsistencies and save you a couple of $1,000 of hiring an editor. So it's pretty good at like the sort of grammatical, syntactical level of things. I think where you want to limit it though is, you know, editing it, allowing it to edit too much, allowing it to like over edit your work and really like take away from what is essentially your own text. But yeah, there's definitely a place for it. Yeah.
And I think with that question, we are out of time. So again, can you everyone please join me in thanking James?